Hello, everyone. As Americans struggle to keep up with rising gas prices, groceries, the cost for rent, homes, everything is going up under Joe Biden. Ironically, right? The irony here is that progressives are saying the way we control this inflation is to undo the Trump tax cuts of 2017. I'm Catherine Mortensen with ALEC Public Affairs. Joining me in the studio is Jonathan Williams. He is ALEC's vice president or executive vice president of policy. And joining us remotely is economist from FreedomWorks, Steven Moore. So thank you for joining me today. And we want to get right into this by looking at what progressives are proposing as a way to control inflation, which is really hurting everyone so much, and versus what we think the more limited government appropriate response should be. And before we get into it, Jonathan and Stephen, I want to just play the quick, short clip of Senator Chuck Schumer from last week. And then I'll have you react to that on the other side.
Way to do it is to undo inflation. The only way to do it is to undo a lot of the Trump tax cuts and raise rates. No Republican is ever going to do that. So the only way to get rid of inflation is through reconciliation. If you want to get rid of inflation, the only way to do it is to undo a lot of the Trump tax cuts and raise rates. No Republican is ever going to do that. So the only way to get rid of inflation is through reconciliation.
I let that play twice so it could sink in for people. Jonathan, that's some sort of crazy jujitsu, I would say, to come up with that as a solution.
No, I mean, this is, it's just unbelievable that you could say that with a straight face and actually believe that raising taxes in the midst of this crisis that we're facing right now is actually going to solve the situation. I mean, what we need to be worried about, and Steve and I have talked about this for a long time now, is stagflation. That's exactly what we're seeing is lots of economic growth, as well as this 40 or 50 year record of inflation. And what Senator Schumer just talked about right there, he doesn't even get his whole caucus behind on the Democrat side, because you have people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema saying no to higher tax rates. And thank God that they did, or otherwise we'd be in much worse shape than we're at today with that negative 1.4% GDP number that just came out last week. Incredibly dangerous times.
Stephen, your reaction to Chuck Schumer's statements?
Well, I think it's important for people, especially our ALEC members, to understand clearly why we've seen inflation go from 1.5% when Trump left office in January of 2021 to now somewhere between 8.5% under Biden in just 15 months. And that's an incredible feat to screw up the economy that quickly, that in that magnitude. And I believe the biggest factor behind this surge, a tidal wave of inflation, has been the runaway government spending, the multi-trillions of dollars. And by the way, there was $1 or $2 trillion that was spent at the end of the Trump administration. And then Biden came in with $3 trillion of additional spending. Remember, he had his American Recovery Act, which was just really a blue state bailout. That I believe had a price tag of $1.9 trillion. Then we passed the sham infrastructure bill, which was really just the Green New Deal. That was another $1.1 trillion. So that's $3 trillion on top of the $1 trillion that was already in the pipeline. And so we just flooded the zone. We just flooded the American economy with all these cheap dollars. And that is the very definition of inflation. Right? I mean, Milton Friedman taught us this 50 years ago. Inflation is when you have more money in the economy and fewer goods, you're going to have higher prices. And I would add to that, by the way, that Biden's war on American energy has also had an extremely negative effect on prices, because energy is one of the things that's a cost in everything that we have, whether it's the lunch that we had today, or there's the microphone I'm speaking in, or the house that I'm living in. Everything is derivative of energy. So my point is that if you want to get this inflation under control, and we have to get. Job number one in Washington right now is get inflation back down to 2, 3. I'd even take 4% at this point. I think the target should be about 2%. And so that means cut government spending. So when Biden says, oh, we need reconciliation, what he's really saying, Schumer, he's really saying, oh, let's spend another $1 or $2 or $3 trillion, which would be putting gasoline on a forest fire. So I really believe until this inflation rate comes down, we're going to face a really tough economy. You've seen the slide in the stock market. You mentioned, Jonathan mentioned the fact that we saw that reduction in the real GDP growth. By the way, nominal GDP grew at a pretty nice pace, 6%. The problem is you've got this hurdle. You've got to get to 8.5% just to get break even, right? So that is the wrecking ball of the economy. It's this high inflation rate.
Thank you, Stephen. And I want to let you know that when I was searching for that clip of Senator Schumer, it was shockingly hard to find out there. The media is not promoting it. Even print stories were few and far between. I found just a smattering of stories in sort of the center-right media that were even talking about this issue. The Washington Examiner had a great guest column, or it was an editorial that they wrote. And what they basically said was when the Trump tax cuts were put in place and signed into law, the progressives were concerned that this was going to benefit the wealthy and that it would, hurt America's, working families and the lower income people. But if you can see there on the screen, the Washington Examiner notes that the data's in. The IRS showed the Trump tax cuts reduced average effective income rates for taxpayers in every bracket, with the largest reduction in rates going to the lower and middle income households. Jonathan, do you want to just expand on that? I mean, who really benefited and what were the benefits of these tax cuts?
I mean, obviously, it was a vast majority of Americans that benefited from the Trump tax cuts. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act signed into law at the end of 2017. That's a point that, Steve and I and ALEC members across the country made, was there were so many pro-growth elements to these tax cuts. And of course, that's why we saw some of the record low unemployment rates, that we saw just such a great booming economy previous to the government lockdowns during COVID. And it's everything from, and the new numbers that you pointed out, show that the majority who actually had the tax cuts made the tax cut more progressive. And so we saw low and middle income Americans seeing some of the greatest benefits. One of the reasons for that was the doubling of the standard deduction. We saw the expansion of child care tax credits. And then, as Steve knows well, something that we at ALEC talked a lot about at the time was this the stopping of the subsidy to high tax states, the SALT deduction, which was unlimited previous to the Trump tax cuts, now is capped at $10,000 annually. And it turns out the vast majority of those benefits go to high income individuals, and a majority of the benefits go to just 4 states. So that's just an incredible way of federal government, and read all of us, our hardworking taxpayer dollars, subsidizing higher income individuals in high tax states. And so President Trump and Congress was exactly right to cap that. And ironically, that's one of the things that Senator Schumer, who we just saw the clip from, would like to undo to benefit New York and actually have a subsidy for wealthy taxpayers.
Right. Exactly. And Stephen, do you want to go on a little bit more on that, of who really benefited from these tax cuts and why they need to be made permanent?
Well, I want to just add one quick point to what we were talking about before about the spending binge in Washington, because ALEC played a key part with many other groups, the Heritage Foundation and American First Principles Institute and almost the whole conservative movement, in blocking this Build Back Better bill. Remember that one? That was the $4 to $5 trillion Biden wanted to pass on top of the $3 trillion I already mentioned. And so thank you to ALEC and ALEC members for really getting involved in that fight. I mean, Jonathan, can you even imagine how high inflation would be today if they had passed that $4 trillion? I mean, we wouldn't be talking about 8.5% inflation. We'd be talking about 18% inflation. So thank you to all the ALEC members who played a key role in that. But look, I mean, Jonathan summarized it very well. I helped write the Trump tax plan. I was working for Trump at the time. With Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer and others, and it really worked like a charm. We did have, big gains in wages for workers across the board. We saw, as Jonathan said, the lowest unemployment rate and the lowest poverty rate for Blacks and Latinos in the country's history. And so I don't really understand the logic of reversing a policy that worked. I think we actually should be talking about maybe finding ways we could do more tax cuts in addition to spending reductions to get the economy moving faster. Because until we get this economy moving faster, we're going to continue to have these trillions of dollars of debt.
And Jonathan, ALEC has model policy that we rolled out just a few weeks ago, asking the states to pass resolutions calling for these Trump tax cuts to be made permanent. Is that an effective way for the states to play a role in this, or what is the state's role?
Well, I mean, the role of the states is to have a voice in this idea that we need to get the American economy back on track again. We need to tackle this runaway inflation problem. We need to tackle the issue of a loss of economic growth, really hitting at this Biden stagflation that we're seeing today. And so what this new resolution does, it was just adopted, as you know, as you referenced, is have states be able to pass that on record if they choose, to say our state delegation wants to have real permanency when it comes to federal tax policy, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act needs to be permanent to give America that confidence to get the economy moving again. And the good news is, as you know, Kat, we've already seen the Arizona Senate pass this. Our good friend, Senator Vince Leach, Senate President Pro Tem, who chairs our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force here at ALEC, read that through and was passed by a majority vote in the Arizona Senate. So we're one state down, and I think many to go as states realize that their voice is very important in this tax policy debate and getting the economy moving again back here in Washington.
Yeah. And Stephen, if I could ask you, because last time I spoke with you, or you were on one of our Zoom calls, you said this is kind of a magic moment for tax reform at the state level. And are we seeing a lot of states move to make very structural, permanent change to give people tax relief right now?
Well, Jonathan Williams has been one of the Pied Pipers of this messaging. And I think, I don't know how many state capitals he's gone to in the last number of months to sell that message, because we did give a lot of money free money to the states. Free, I'm using that in air quotes because that's not free. It's federal taxpayers paid for it. Then we send it to the states. And the good news is we are seeing a lot of states reduce taxes. Jonathan knows those numbers better than I do, but I think there were about 6 or 7 states that cut income tax rates. I think, a number reduced their corporate tax rates. So that's the proper response with all of this money. And there's still, most states actually have record budget surpluses now. So I think the proper response to that is to cut your taxes now so that you can have your state grow faster. I mean, we know that the states that have really been carrying the economy, especially over the COVID period, are states like Florida and Texas and Utah and Montana and Tennessee. And, the states that are really falling behind are obviously New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and California. So that those red states especially have a real opportunity now to continue to cut taxes. And we keep pushing for a few states, and Jonathan knows these states that are looking at maybe abolishing their income tax, as Texas and Florida and Tennessee have done.
Yeah, I mean, in our Rich States, Poor States report that Steve and I write with Arthur every year that just came out for tax day, we document, the states that are competitive, the states that are cutting taxes. Utah's number 1, North Carolina 2, Arizona 3, some of the most competitive states in America today that we've documented. But this has really been historically an important year when it comes to tax reform at the state capital level. Some of this is because of the historic surpluses sitting there, whether they were organically generated, or as Steve said, the phony dollars from Washington propping up state budgets right now, which we warned against in the bailout of states. And as it turns out, we were exactly right. By the time we saw the numbers come through, state and local governments were actually ahead in revenue in the pandemic year, not behind. And so all this extra money that's come from Washington has just been additional opportunities in some states to spend it. Other states, though, it does give us this golden opportunity to cut taxes in a permanent, in a pro-growth way. And we've seen 4 states this year. This is really historic, as Steve knows, is it took us 110 years of states having income taxes to get to 4 states to have a flat tax from a progressive income tax. And guess what, folks? In the last 8 weeks, we've seen 4 more states become flat tax states, starting in Iowa. Then we saw the court ruling in Arizona. We saw Mississippi, and we saw Georgia get across the finish line. And so we're seeing some really historic times when it comes to good pro-taxpayer reforms out there.
And one thing I want to ask both of you, the last question I have is certainly now during the Biden administration years, it almost seems like we're seeing this big divide with the states going in one direction, the federal government going in the opposite direction. I mean, what does this mean long term? Can the states really be competitive economically and prosper despite having a federal government that seems to be making all the wrong decisions when it comes to taxing and spending? Can we, how will that look?
Well, I mean, I'd love to get Steve's take on this too, but I think, part of what I'm hearing from state legislators every day that are trying to do these fundamental tax reform changes right now is it's in exactly because of this. It's in a response to the horrible policies coming from people like Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden right now at the federal level, that states feel like they need to continue down this road of being even more aggressive at cutting taxes to make up the difference for this quagmire really that we face in Washington right now, with this desire from the majorities in Congress to raise taxes and become even less competitive as a country. And so this is the proper response, though. And ALEC, we believe in states being laboratories of democracy. States need to have this autonomy to be able to push back, although there are going to be some headwinds due to the big government policies, at least currently being talked about in Washington.
Steve, how do you think this will play out? I mean, can the states sort of compete with the federal government in this way?
Well, I'm very worried about the national economy right now. I mean, we have a president who's pushing all the wrong buttons, and it's, that has a negative effect. And we're skating right now on the verge of a recession. The first quarter, as Jonathan mentioned, was negative. The official definition of recession is 2 quarters. Now, I don't think the second quarter is going to be negative, but we're skating on the edge of that. And when you have people like Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and AOC keep talking about, well, let's raise taxes, let's have more government spending, let's have more government regulation, now they're saying, well, we're going to reduce the energy prices by putting new taxes on the energy firms. Jonathan, you got to explain that one to me. I don't even get the logic of that. So this is a precarious situation. Now, as my friend Larry Kudlow would say, the cavalry is coming. I think we're going to see some big changes in these November elections. But now is the time, I think, for states to be really cautious in terms of, having massive new spending programs and so on, because, the states cannot really affect the national economy. They can only affect how they're doing in their own states. And we have so many great governors right now out there, everybody from Kim Reynolds to Ron DeSantis to Governor Lee of Tennessee, and I could go on and on. But, this is a precarious time for the economy. I'm just going to say that. I think we can still avoid a recession, but we've got to take policies in Washington to bring the inflation rate down. And it would be great if our state legislators at ALEC would really send that message. Get inflation down. You're killing everything. Your real wages are falling. Real economy is falling. Real savings are falling. The real stock market is falling. We cannot prosper with an inflation rate of 8, 9, or 10%. It's just not going to work.
Before we go to our last final comments, I just wanted to put this up. I thought this was a fun quote to end on from Will Rogers. People who complain about taxes can be divided into 2 classes, men and women. That is for sure. That's like our favorite thing to do here at ALEC, is to complain about taxes.
In my household, it's the women who complain about the taxes, because my wife pays all the bills.
Right? Yeah. That's exactly the truth. But on a serious note, I mean, what are the final thoughts here that you have, Jonathan, about this issue? And then also, Steve, if you have any final thoughts, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think one of the big things is the takeaway from our resolution that our members just passed, and that we saw passed in Arizona that we talked about, is if nothing is done at the federal level by the end of 2025, all of the Trump tax cuts for individuals go away if nothing is done. And so states putting their voice on record right now saying, to address this stagflation that we're realizing, to get the federal economy moving again, as we need real economic growth, and to address inflation without raising taxes and without spending more dollars, this is a good way for states to go on record to say enough is enough. We need to have permanency in tax cuts for individuals across the board.
And Stephen, did you have any final comments or thoughts on this?
Well, getting those tax cuts that we put in place back in 2017 permanent would be a great first step to reviving the economy, no question about it. And Alex played a key role. And I'm so glad that so many state legislators have weighed in on this, because they have, believe it or not, they have very strong voices, not just in the state capitals, but in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you both. And thanks all of you who joined us. We just appreciate what those state lawmakers are doing. And we appreciate what you're doing, Stephen, and of course, Jonathan, to bring tax relief. And the last thing I'll say is, and there was a ticker going across the bottom, the tax cuts of 2017 resulted in a $6,000 increase in real median household income over the past 2 years. So remember that. That's why we're in this fight. This is real for people. $6,000 for the average family. It can pay for a student's private school or swim lessons or whatever programs all these kids are in that are so expensive. $6,000 goes a long way. I know as a parent that money meant a lot to me and my family. So thank you to what you're doing. And thanks to all of you who are out there watching and to all of our great ALEC members. We'll see you next time on another ALEC TV live stream.